One of the other things to consider is the timeline of decision making. How far in advance, or what degree of urgency are our consumers? And it's important to segment or understand this as well, because we may have a consumer that works on a timeline of days. That is, from the time of decision, commitment, booking and undertaking, it could be a matter of hours, it could be a matter of days, and that's a very, very compressed timeline when it comes to the consumption, when it comes to the engagement, the support and the management. Everything from visas to bookings to flights to boarding passes, travel insurance, all of those aspects now are on a compressed timeline. So it may be well researched in advance, it may be the culmination of a lot of planning and preparation, or it may just be spontaneous or based on habit, and off they go in a short period of time. Then we've got other consumers that might work weeks in advance because they're looking for cost efficiencies. There's a little more involved. It may entail school holidays, it may be certain types of the year, budgets, salaries, savings, all those sorts of things. So there's an extended timeline associated, and then there can be those that may book months in advance. They're doing a whole lot of preparation. Whilst they haven't committed 100% to it, there's a whole host of things that gives significant prolonged timeline to influence, manage and assure. Now, there's interesting considerations for all of these demographics. Now, the pictures are not 100% reflective. Any apologies to anybody who sits in any of those categories and you don't feel that you look like that. These are just representative of the types of demographics and age groups that are often associated, but it's also a significant problem when it comes to changing their mind or getting them to consider certain things, particularly when we're talking about safety and security, because those that have booked weeks and months in advance have a lot invested in this. So a lot can happen, everything from natural disasters to economic to infrastructure to pricing to currency exchange, health conditions, viruses, global terrorism, a whole bunch of things might be very topical or influence their destination, but they've been hanging on or looking forward to this travel for so long. And it's often very, very difficult to get them to change at the last moment or to reconsider, or they've simply got so much invested in it that they feel it's make or break, they have to go. The hours or days in advance, maybe not so much. They're a little bit more driven by spontaneity or short-term desires, all those sorts of things, or opportunity, because remembering in this, again, we talk about this later, about the economic opportunity. If they're selling significantly discount pricing and accommodation, then that can push people who may have traditionally been months in advance or weeks in advance to simply hours and days. So you'll find this blending between the three primary demographics, but these are the three main consumer groups that we also have to factor in as we understand the audience. It could be someone that made the decision and they're off in a matter of days with little to no research or background preparation, and that's part of the excitement and the adventure, up to and including those that are booking a cruise or have looked at this for years as part of their, again, reward or adventure, and they've done every little step along the way, and now they need to reaffirm, reassess, or there's something that's changed their initial perception. So these are the significant factors that we're talking about when we talk about the demographics and the consumer in all of these equations. So what are the influences? So I've touched on some of these already in terms of the influences around the decision making. So we're talking about the compelling reasons, we're talking about the types of demographics, but what is it that active nature or elemental elements that influence the individual when they buy or make these decisions? So benchmarking often comes into it. So what they perceive to be a higher, lower or equal destination. So they could be travelling to a destination because they know it's less developed, because it's different, because it's not comparative, or otherwise they would travel domestically. They would go to another city somewhere in their own country. But there's an expectation sometimes that capital cities will be like capital cities all around the world. So London's not the same as New York, it's not the same as Singapore, it's not the same as Hong Kong, it's not the same as Beijing. But again, depending on their experience and their influences, self or actual, determines their decision-making or choices. Some people will just want to get away from it. They want to get lost in the jungle. They want to get lost in remote locations and villages and get away from it all, or the perception of being. Now, over the last couple of decades here in Asia Pacific, there have been little undiscovered villages that became a popular getaway that have now become significant quasi-cities in their own rights. And Bali in Indonesia is a classic example for a lot of Australians, where it had that remote, tranquil, untouched, and now it's become, part of a city with 1.2 million Australians travelling there every year. It's not quite the little undeveloped village that it was a number of years ago, but now people are looking at Mataram, they're looking at Lombok, they're looking at Gili Islands, they're looking at different locations that had what Bali had 10, 20, 30 years ago. So they make that comparison, or their availability to consume or understand what is comparable from where they're going to where they're going to. Now, in Asia Pacific, as we talk about cross borders, some people in Asia, when they're travelling from their own location, are actually travelling, even though they're going cross border, are travelling to a superior infrastructure, superior environment, or more expensive economy in some influences. So they're doing some sort of rationale between, well, what's my money going to be worth when I travel to here? What can I afford to do? And that's where these realizations, or these self or perceived benchmarking influences start to take shape. And pride and culture, associated with how willing they are to experiment with other people's culture, or how proud they are of their own heritage, or things they will and won't do. What their historical backgrounds are with certain nationalities and countries, and this is something that a lot of providers don't necessarily understand unless they're from a similar pedigree, is that sometimes we're talking generational opinions on certain classes and ethnicities and destinations because it was shaped out of the Second World War, it was shaped through historical treatment or recent events. And therefore, it's a contributing factor that's ingrained. Whether they remember or were present or born during the original influences, pride and culture have a significant place of prominence when making decisions to travel to certain destinations. Now, equally, what that also comes with is that the more in many instances, the more of their own particular ethnicity or demographic that go to a destination can also be a draw card. So if there's a lot of Chinese tourists going to a destination, or Japanese tourist, or Indian tourist, or Australian tourist going to a destination, that can give a sense of comfort or familiarity for individuals. It can also be totally polarizing, and some people go, nope, that's where all of my said demographic go. I don't want anything to do with them. I want to get away. And so it can have that the repelling factor as opposed to the attraction factor as well. But again, pride and culture factors in significantly with this. Economics, pure and simple, is the cost associated. Can they afford? So we've got currency exchange. We've got how do you get money out? Do you deal with cash? Can you use credit card, debit cards, Apple Pay Wave? There's a whole Apple Pay and a whole bunch of other factors that people need to and will consider when they make decisions. So will I go to destination A? Let's say Phuket in Thailand. Will I go to Phuket? Well, how much money will I get? Well, I've got a budget of this. Actually, it's cheaper if I go to Surabaya in Indonesia, or Bali in Indonesia, or somewhere. They're making these economic rationales, and they may only make selections based on their own limited understanding. There's often not a comparison to say, well, actually, if I go to Malaysia and KL, they have fantastic sales. I'll go to KL and I'll do all of the shopping and eat and travel and do everything I want because of the currency exchange, because of the infrastructure and this, and all of those influence factors. They may only select from a very short list because that's their terms of reference, or that's all they have access to at the time, or they may learn over time from experience or social networks that, okay, there are other choices. Likewise, the things that dominate, they may look, when they see the local news or they consume information, they may see that the yen or the US dollar is higher or lower because, again, it's constantly and repeatedly shown to them, whereas some of the other currencies, they may be totally unaware of. They don't understand the fluctuations. And again, hotels and airlines are not necessarily good at this because they may have fixed pricing, or the airline may drop their prices but the accommodation doesn't, or their pricing may be inconsistent with various currency influences at the time. So again, they can often be out of sync, and many travellers find themselves caught out because they got cheap flights, but then there's expensive accommodation and all of those sort of factors abound as well. Not to mention, when hotels offer discounts, stay 2 nights and get 1 free night, or the airlines are offering cheap packages or deals. It is a compelling reason. So they may throw all of their other research to the wind and say, this is a really cheap deal, it's available right now, I have to act, I'm going. And then backfill the information around, well, what is this destination? What do I do? Where do I go? They were simply driven by the price that was displayed to them at the time. And public opinion. Like it or not, a lot of tourism information and advice associated, whether travellers should or should not travel, is associated with public opinion, and it's so horribly wrong in many instances. And one good example here has been the understanding or the announcements and perception of political turmoil in Thailand over the last few years. There's been many tourists that have cancelled travel to Bangkok or parts of Thailand because of what they've seen on the news or because of what they've consumed. And it's just been so horribly wrong. It's been so overstated, it's been so inaccurate or so unrelated to the traveller and the tourism industry that operators, the economy, the city have suffered significantly, and people have then travelled to nearby Asian countries that didn't have, the word coup and military junta and all those sorts of things mentioned in the headlines, only to find that they were at greater risk because there's underdeveloped infrastructure, there's less accommodation for tourism, that is, they're unprepared for tourists, and if something horrible happens and they do meet a medical emergency, they end up being transported back into Thailand because it's a better place of treatment and resources and international standards. So public opinion, unfortunately, plays a lot of influence to the general consumer because that's where they get their information from. They're not seeking qualified, or they don't get access to, or there's not relevant enough information being presented. So public opinion can destroy entire tourism markets. If we look at Nepal, with the earthquake that occurred there, the economy associated with tourism was critical for the revitalisation of the country, but their ability to get the information out over the top of the headlines that said, the country's destroyed, everything's in ruins, don't go there. It's, again, a significant problem that affects both the tourism industry and the decision-making process of the individuals, because public opinion, I won't say more often than not, but in many instances simply isn't relevant to tourists or the individual. It's news for the sake of news. The desirability aspect. How romantic is the destination in terms of it's been portrayed, I would love to go to, you hear a lot of people when they talk about, I'd love to go to Paris, I'd love to go, because it's based on a desirability. It's from movies, it's from books, it's from conversations, it's from some deep-seated longing for that sort of experience, but it may not be comparable, or there may be alternatives to that, or their experience once they arrive may be vastly different. And the same thing applies in the Asia Pacific region. There are just some destinations that are more desirable to certain demographics. People who want to climb mountains and live in rugged conditions and with a sort of bohemian backpacker, they gravitate towards Nepal. People that want the high-end lifestyle and shopping and the luxe tend to gravitate towards Singapore and Hong Kong. So there's the desirability factor associated in their decision making, whether they've been there before or they've been influenced by it. Regardless of the information or the facts of the matter, they are still compelled and driven by the desirability and how that's portrayed to them. And speaking of Bali, there are images getting around of Bali that simply are not true today. As I said, unpopulated beaches, white sands and so on, yes, they do occur, but it's a very popular tourist destination and there's been a lot of development there, and simply not the same as what it was many years ago. So people may be deliberately or unnecessarily led by the desirability, only to discover later on that it's not quite the same. But again, it's an emotional factor that drives decision making. And marketing. I spoke about this. If the airlines are pushing, the accommodation's pushing, or there's a whole host of economic motivators for people to consume or to buy a particular way, it's a very, very compelling reason for people to act. Particularly on a compressed or shortened timeline, because their decision making and their ability to act is influenced by the perishable offer. So they will make decisions spur of the moment, or they will go a particular way. But again, all of these factors can have a compounding domino effect as they get closer to the destination or their final outcome. And some locations are geared and prepared and have representative bodies around travel and tourism. They're very accommodating to tourists. They're all about tourism. Their entire economy is predicated on it. And therefore, there's a sense of relation, that they can relate to. Oh yeah, well, it's got this, and all of their questions are answered. There's no surprises in their mind, or there's no discovery that they need to do on their own end, because all the hard work's been done, or there's a tourism outpost. But conversely, as I said before, and Thailand is a very good example, is whereby the facts of the matter were not being conveyed by the tourism body, and they weren't being consumed by tourists. They should and could have still travelled to the destination, but news dominated it. Yes, there was no dispute that there is a fantastic and capable tourism network within the city and the country. However, it's often not portrayed that way. Or they can be at loggerheads. So there might be a compelling campaign to get travellers to come to a destination, but it's difficult to get a visa, or they don't accept credit card, or there's no drinking water, or there's a whole host of things that are simply incongruent or inconsistent with what the marketing campaign says and what the facts on the ground are like, because the government agencies don't work the same way, or you've got a government agent standing there that they don't care. If you've got the wrong visa or the wrong booking or not the right, that's it, you're gone. And again, that sort of stuff is what is picked up and shared by consumers, and it can really undermine and affect the tourism industry, like it or not. And the infrastructure. What's available? Depending on all of those factors of desirability and the culture and immersion, some people can be accepting of the fact that, things are not quite right. The trains are different, the cars are different, the roads are different, everything's different. Or there just can be a very, very high expectation, particularly now in the Asia-Pacific region, where there's been so much expansion in infrastructure. And this depends on the economic capabilities of the city and the country themselves to invest in infrastructure. But many Chinese travellers, for example, at the moment, are so used to having everything brand new, because so many things are brand new in China. Whether it's roads, whether it's accommodation, whether it's airports, whether it's trains, it's all brand new. And then to travel to somewhere like Australia, for example, and then find that it's not quite as new, it's not quite as contemporary, or it's quite as luxe. Often a point of frustration. Japanese tourists the same, Indian tourists, so it's much the same in the sense that if where they're coming from, there's an expectation or a predication that the infrastructure will be commensurate with their desires and their expectations. And if they're not met or they're disappointed, again, the whole world and all of their relatives and everybody they know on social media or any review sites will very quickly hear about it or be updated. The rule of law, what is enforceable, what is maintained, how it's applied, is it consistent, is it applied to tourists equally to locals, is increasingly becoming an issue, and also a vast difference across the region. There are simply local laws and international traveller laws that are inconsistently applied. Things like motorcycle helmets, for example. Yes, you should wear one, but in some locations, the power of tourist dollars and so on is too compelling, so we won't enforce it on tourists. However, a lot of tourists fall off, and therefore they're injured, and it costs a lot of money. People are hurt and die, and a host of other things. Sometimes the law is simply not equally applied. Now, this can catch out a lot of travellers if they're used to the rule of law being equally applied or administered or consistent, or an expectation of justice, only to find out that well, they've rented from a questionable jet ski operator on a beach environment. He's now used a couple of muscle men to stand over them. They're demanding thousands of dollars, and the local authorities are not overly helpful in helping them defend themselves or prosecute or chase them away, because there is an ecosystem or an industry that preys on tourists in this particular environment, and everybody benefits if everyone just keeps quiet, because that's the way it is. And unfortunately, these sorts of unsavoury experiences, again, are often what's reported in the media or spoken about amongst tourists, or simply not discovered. Now, there are some social demographics or ethnicities that are preyed upon by their own criminal elements. There's criminal gangs, there's Korean criminal gangs, Japanese criminal, Chinese, Australian, European gangs that target their own ethnic groups in some of these areas around Asia Pacific, and it's not talked about. It's hidden. It's not disclosed. They could be ATM credit card skimming. It could be going into a bar and then demanding $500 for a beer, or those sorts of things. Again, if the rule of law is not available and applied, it can cause problems or a significant surprise, an unexpected surprise or expensive surprise for a lot of travellers. The military and police, and we've put them deliberately sort of as combined because they're indistinguishable in some environments, but they're also vastly inconsistent. You've got a military, you've got a police environment in many parts of India where policemen carry sticks. They don't have firearms, or they've got World War II firearms. So how they combat or how they're seen measured up against coming from somewhere like Singapore or Hong Kong or Thailand or so on, it's vastly inconsistent. Or the military and police have been involved in corruption and issues, or they're simply not available, or there's a special tourist police which makes it better in some instances. Again, that sense of safety or that sense of protection that's afforded travellers in a foreign environment a long way from home under different circumstances can also be an influencing factor. This includes nightclub activity. So after dark, do the police all disappear? And it's bandits and criminals run supreme. And again, these are the sorts of experiences that influence decision making, particularly family groups, particularly those that are not necessarily as adventurous. They're looking for these telltale signs of, is there a police officer? Is there a police car? Is there, authorities that, I know have got my best interest at heart? And if that's conspicuously absent, then perhaps not. The Public Security Bureau in China, for example, it does not necessarily have a direct and open engagement with foreign tourists, for example, in certain areas. It's undiscernible as to whether this is military or police, or are they helping me, or how do I get help, because of a lot of cultural and language barriers and expectations, or in many instances because the tourists and the foreigners and the visitors are the ones committing most of the crimes and the problems. And again, this is where I was talking about the loggerheads, that the promotion of tourism and the actual experience on the ground can often be at loggerheads. Emergency services too. So in the event of, bad things happen to good people all the time. In the event of something, whether it be a sprained ankle, speaking of China, the Great Wall of China, people spraining ankles, breaking ankles and so on. What's the emergency services availability? How quickly? Is it consistent? Do they speak English? Have you got travel insurance? It's a must. Everybody needs to be travelling with travel insurance. To be honest, you're a fool if you don't. What's the access to it? What's the capability? What's the standards? Or what's the expectation? I'm travelling to Singapore. It's all fantastic. Well, you factor in a few other elements with Singapore and heavy rains on a Friday night during a Formula One, and the ambulance and emergency services are not that great, or they're affected by the same influences or negative factors associated with many other countries around the world. Can you get medicines? Do you need a doctor's prescription? All of these sorts of things then become a very real problem for your holiday, for whether it be children or whether it be adults. If you look at things like baby formula in China, you've got many families that simply won't consume the Chinese-made product, and they're importing it from Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, and other parts of the world. The same goes for emergency services. It may not be the expectation. Nursing, in some instances, is not even considered a profession. Looking after, or the palliative care of an individual when they're in both emergency and sort of palliative treatment, that's done by the family. Well, if you're a traveller, your family's not there. How does that work? Who do you contact? How do you contact? Who is the first person that's going to pick you up on the side of the street when you've fallen over or injured yourself is a very, very big question, and it's vastly inconsistent across the entire Asia-Pacific region, not to mention cities and countries themselves. It's a various equation, and also where there's highly densely populated tourist activities, it also occurs because day or night or different standards is a major problem. The standard of care, which I've spoken about, so subsequently after that, once you've made it to an emergency treatment facility, what happens? How does that work? Are things sterile? Are people trained? Is there enough resources? Is there world-class medication and all those sorts of things? Does the facility even have power after a certain time, or is there a doctor staffing? There's a whole host of questions that come into the standard of care, not just because you've had a horrible experience in an accident, but things can escalate, whether it be an allergy, whether it be because you've fallen and injured yourself, or you're of a certain age and you've forgotten your medication. All of these things now come into consideration, and the standard of care and the people providing it can be a very, very big question mark or problem. Not to mention the cost of everything, the cost of water, the cost of transport, the cost of, do you tip, does everything cost you? Have you got to pay to use a bathroom or a toilet? What do you consider reasonable? And many a tourist have become excited, agitated or angry over the cost of what turns out later on when they realise it's a few cents to use a bathroom or a few cents to pay for something that they would ordinarily get for free. What does it cost? Particularly for the cost-conscious traveller that's itemising everything or preserving their budget, or is the first day on a particular journey, what does it cost? People will quite gladly carry your bags at the airport for a cost, whereas in some locations it's illegal, or it's not done that way, or it's free trolleys are provided. It depends on the economy, it depends on a lot of factors, but everybody's constantly looking at how much does it cost, both on an hour per hour, but also on the life cycle of that particular journey. How much can they afford? And it shapes their decision making. And this is often where corners are cut. Yes, I could rent a helmet with that motorbike, but you know what, it's cheaper, so I won't. But the subsequent cost of not doing that is debilitating. In some instances, cost people their lives because they were saving a few dollars. The same goes for accommodation. The same goes for transport. I'll just take public transport. It's for locals public transport. It's not for foreigners, and you find yourself being exposed to a whole host of unnecessary threats. And standards, and I've spoken about this a lot on this, is the standard of everything. Can you drink the water? Electricity, food, police, transport, are they roadworthy? Is the airport serviceable? All these sorts of things, again, literally are an up and down variation because they're inconsistent from one location to another. And again, the awareness of travellers or their ability to identify the standards is often poorly developed, or they simply, it's all part of the experience. When I get into a taxi in Bangkok, no, I don't wear a seatbelt. Why? Because, that's just the local. I'm being local. No, that's not the case at all. People are very, very quick to surrender their standards and their benchmarks of their own life safety and security when they travel. The other thing that they don't often understand, which plays into the economics, is the value of the things that they may have. Their watch, their phone, their backpack, their shoes could be a month, a week, 6 months worth of salaries in some locations. So it becomes inherently valuable, even though they've discounted it as it's just a watch, it's just a pair of shoes. That's now intrinsically valuable to at a local standard because of the economic disparities or the ability to get it and so on and so forth. And communications, more and more, if people can't update their Facebook page or Snapchat or Instagram certain events, then it's influencing their purchasing decisions. they won't travel, or they're buying local SIM cards, or they're consuming data, or they're hooking into Wi-Fi, they're using the airport. So communications and the ability and the frequency and the cost is a contributing factor for a lot of travellers, good, bad or otherwise. And it factors into the decision making, even though that it's not readily available in many instances, or it's not as communicated. There are not secret societies, but there are social groups that share this information. What's the Wi-Fi like at the airport? Can I check my email? Where can I get free communications downtown? And all those sorts of things. Oh, go to a Starbucks. You know, you will find in many parts of Asia where there's Starbucks that lots of backpackers and so on not even consuming a coffee just because they know that there's free Wi-Fi, or if you buy a coffee you get Wi-Fi and they can be there for hours. So all of these connectivity issues are something first and foremost in the minds of the consumer now when they travel. Religion can be an influencing factor in the sense that with the perception of Christianity, of Islam and so on, Buddhism, some people will not travel to some locations because, it's that particular religion. Now, the facts of the matter remain that the news is often incorrect. The news is often apportioning a particular viewpoint, and most people's perception about religion, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, anything for that matter, is inherently wrong. So as a result, destinations are being included or excluded on grounds of religion. And you hear a lot of negative, Indonesia's is the largest Muslim country on... So what? It means nothing. It's a fragmented island. There's hundreds of millions of people. So what? But people will be making decisions based on that. Or this is in part why destinations like Bali became popular to some instances, because it's not a Muslim state. So as a result, it's an influencing factor, whether they are of the Islamic faith, whether they are Christians, whether they're Buddhist. When they're making these decisions, when they're travelling and when they arrive, they are making their own considerations, rightly or wrongly, on how they will be perceived, how will they be treated, how will they be respected from a perspective of religion, or will they have an affinity because it's a multicultural environment and religion's not such a big deal. Those things are significantly first and foremost in the decision-making process of travellers. Language, the ability to understand, communicate. There's a lot of applications, tools and resources, but some destinations and environments, despite being overtly welcome to travellers, simply does not have the infrastructure, simply does not accommodate for diversity or certain concentrations. In the same breath, some destinations can be very, very much focused on a particular demographic. Everything can be in Chinese or Japanese or Arabic or Thai or English, French or whatever the case may be, because they're very much invested in the tourism, or even some of the local providers speak a little or can communicate in multi-language. Remembering that in Asia Pacific, that it's very rare that people speak just two languages or two dialects. In Asia Pacific, you've often got people speaking multiple languages because of where they're from and their influences and how they work, whereas a lot of tourists, particularly from Europe and Australia and US, coming into the Asia Pacific region are at a significant disadvantage because more often than not, English is the only language in which they're able to communicate. Airline routes themselves, the providers influence these factors. There may be a lot of readily available flights to support demand or encourage travel to a destination, or it may be inherently harder to get to a particular destination because there's no flights or there's no code share or there's no relationship or the airport. So where there is high volume and a lot of frequency, a lot of advertising and discounts and so on tends to be where people travel, particularly when it comes to sovereign airlines. If you're flying Thai Airways, then you know what, going via Bangkok is likely to occur. Malaysian Airlines via KL, Singapore via Singapore, Cathay via Hong Kong and so on. So it depends on the airlines. In a lot of instances, people will shape their decisions around the availability of airline routes, even though it's not the most direct route from A to B. Whether you're a business traveller or otherwise, the ease of business. This comes into the rule of law and the transparency and corruption and a whole host of other things. Can you just get things done? It can be something as simple as room service. It can be something as simple as getting a taxi or organising a change or a tour or a bunch of other things. But the ease of getting things done, some people will, forego some luxuries or some benefits or inconvenience for short duration. However, the longer the trip, the less likely they are, or if it may determine whether they're going to be a repeat customer. Just getting things done. If it's all just too hard, and this can start with getting a visa. If it's just too hard and too problematic, then they just won't travel. They'll go somewhere else because it's easier. And ease and convenience, again, is a decision-making influence. Individual factors. We at Intelligent Travel focus on individuals because every individual journey is unique, the traveller is unique, their activities are unique. So the individual themselves, their experience, their ethnicity, their ability to communicate, their open-mindedness, their religion, all of these individual factors will also make a consideration for the traveller, whether they're making a conscious decision, making a selection. All of these things will weigh in their final decision. They will weigh up, subconsciously or otherwise, their own risk appetite, their own comfort levels with certain things or what they're going to surrender. And these individual factors can sometimes be grouped into larger demographics to say, this particular group's like this, adventure, activity, shopping and so on. But everyone's still very, very individualistic, and the travel industry is becoming significantly more orientated towards individual preferences, buying online, bookings, personal profiles, frequent flyers and so on. But tourism itself is still treating people like groups of individuals and not customizing some of these personal nuances, which for those markets that have started to do it is attracting more travellers because of the self-importance, because of the customization, the individual factor.